For many people in a modern secular world, there's a great nostalgia to return to a time of spiritual consensus and religious vividness in which there is an evidence and clarity of common spiritual enlightenment that all of society perceives. You see this, for instance, in religious conservatives who often seek to mobilize society to return to some period, some lost period, it is thought, of religious right-orderedness. In Catholic reactionaries, sometimes this takes the form of a nostalgia for a picture image of the medieval age. In Protestant and Catholic conservatives, it also sometimes takes the image of some period earlier in the 20th century, or perhaps the 19th century, or perhaps before the French Revolution, when everything was said to be aright within society. And yet Charles Taylor, the philosopher and social theorist, holds that religious conservatives are wrong to hold this kind of a view that you can return, because everyone is secular today in the sense that we've all taken on a social imaginary that he calls the immanent frame. We have helped together build a sense of the meaning of the world, which Taylor tries to capture in this term of his, the immanent frame. The immanent frame is a modern social imaginary that replaced the medieval, cosmically spiritual, spooky, magic, enchanted system of nature with a way of perceiving and being in the world which makes it possible to bracket or shave off spiritual dimensions and agencies. The immanent frame is a way of perceiving and being in the world which makes it possible to bracket or shave off spiritual dimensions and agencies. They can even appear, Taylor says, as an optional extra. This is partly, yes, a Newtonian grid or system of material objects. Newtonian notions of time as homogeneous sequence of punctual moments, space as immanent, but it's also part of Taylor's large backstory of how secularism happened through the transformation of the medieval self from a porous self to a modern, more buffered self, where the medieval porous self perceived spirits, sprites, enchanted magics in everything from government to, the woods and the mountains. The modern self is buffered in that it sees a strong divide between the world and the meanings that are mobilized or constructed into it. And so for the buffered self, for instance, government is not something that is just unproblematically handed down out of the spiritual dimension. It doesn't just emerge immediately out of the spiritual dimension. It occurs in the immanent frame in historical time. Modern people don't accept that a god came down and founded Rome, right? They don't accept that a god came down and founded Athens or Tenochtitlan or something like that, spirits and agencies of that kind. They think something happened within what Taylor calls the immanent frame. And this immanent frame has, as part of it, a buffered self that sees itself as having to construct social and political projects, mobilize for them together with others. And so we live in the wake and after what Taylor refers to as an age of mobilizations. Even attempts to re-enchant the world require mobilizations. And this is what religious conservatives, miss in their polemics against secularity. They too live in a secular age insofar as their social imaginary concerning, for instance, politics, not to mention the actual workings of the natural world, require human action or mobilization in some sense in order to re-enchant. In other words, even if you want to re-enchant the cosmos and re-enchant politics, modern people do it in a modern way, meaning they think it's on them to do it through mass mobilization. And in this sense, even traditionalists are modern because they're working against the background social imaginary of the immanent frame. Taylor's way of theorizing and analyzing this kind of movement that is paradoxically very modern in its nostalgia for the traditional is through the terms paleo and neo-Durkheimian. Those are key terms for Taylor. Emile Durkheim was the famous French sociologist who argued that all societies are constructed around some notion of the sacred. That's why Taylor's taking Durkheim's last name and saying that one of the typical forms of political construction and mobilization in the modern age is Durkheimian. By Durkheimian, Taylor means concepts of a Christian society as fused to political life, attempts to fuse the sacred and the political power. Paleo-Durkheimian is an official church, according to Taylor, encompassing all of society. For example, think of a kind of Anglican state church, or certain Protestant Nordic countries, or certain Catholic absolutisms. Neo-Durkheimian is a dispensation in which differing denominations all belong diffusely to a wider sense of the sacred. This one's more familiar in the United States. The movement to mobilize what's quote-unquote called Christian culture, or something like that, where various denominations, Protestant, Catholic, and others participate in trying to mobilize a kind of reinstantiation of the sacred. In other words, sacred identities in the modern world are distinctly secular and modern in that they have to be created and constructed by a mobilization within the immanent frame. This is part of Taylor's analysis of the emergence of denominational churches and evangelicalism as well. But it also points to his discussion of nationalism, which is what I want to say a word on. Nationalism, religious nationalisms, Christian nationalism, which are surging again today, often think of themselves as returning to the past, returning to a sort of cosmos that's enchanted. In fact, they are distinctly modern and like the French revolutionaries that they associate with secularism, precisely because their movements are mobilized in the style of the French revolutionaries and of openly, explicitly secular political movements. In other words, although the beliefs mobilized may not be secular, they may be said to be in the name of some church or denomination, the style and method of politics is inescapably secular. That's Taylor's deep insight, because secular needs to be understood in this deeper sense of the construction of a social imaginary collectively and historically that divides us from the medieval spooky and enchanted cosmos, and to which it is difficult to return because we have a sense of ourselves as buffered. We don't think that if a government is toppled down, that suddenly we see, witches flying through the air, or spirits, or different spooky elements within nature that participate in the chain of being, which includes the government. No, we think of the government as something that people succeed or fail to do, and there might be a religious story about that, but it's not a spooky, enchanted story. It's a story that's told even by religious people inside the confines and boundaries of the immanent frame. The big problem then becomes the emergence of sort of moralistic mobilizations. Traditional and conservative religious politics are often, in fact, distinctly modern. They mobilize abstract moral codes akin to the way the French revolutionaries mobilized around, say, equality and freedom and fraternity, the three that are the slogan in the French Revolution. Religious conservatives, in a mirror image of that, mobilize around an abstract moralism that is said to secure or rechristen society around certain issues, right? Issues like sexual ethics becomes a big one in modern Christianity, right belief of certain kinds, etc. And so it becomes a crusade to save civilization through mobilizing within the immanent frame. A question to think about is, so how does one ever regain, as a buffered self, one's connection to the transcendent? Or is that just a hopeless cause? Are we trapped in the immanent frame? It seems like religious mobilization doesn't do it. So how do we regain access to the transcendent? That is a very big question that Taylor seeks to answer as he moves along in his grand historical narrative and genealogy of a secular age.